Margaret's manicured fingers pointed at the cracked concrete like she was condemning a war criminal. "This eyesore is bringing down property values," she declared, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. But when the tow truck's chains scraped against asphalt 3 days later, dragging her pristine BMW across David's freshly seeded lawn, her perfectly composed mask finally cracked. "Sometimes karma doesn't knock, it crashes through your front yard at 30 miles per hour, David." Chen pressed his face against the kitchen window, watching his neighbor Margaret Whitmore march across the street with the determination of a woman on a mission. Her heels clicked against the pavement like a metronome counting down to confrontation. In her perfectly manicured hand, she clutched what looked like official documents. "Oh, come on," David muttered, recognizing the storm clouds gathering in her expression. He'd lived across from Margaret for 3 years, and he knew that look. It meant trouble. The doorbell rang with the persistence of a fire alarm. David set down his coffee mug and opened the door to find Margaret standing on his crumbling front steps. Her blonde hair pulled back so tightly it seemed to stretch her features into a permanent expression of disapproval. "David," she said, not bothering with pleasantries, "we need to talk." "Good morning to you too, Margaret." David stepped aside reluctantly. "Coffee. This isn't a social call." She swept past him into his modest living room, her designer suit looking absurdly out of place among his second-hand furniture. "I'm here about your sidewalk." David glanced through the window at the concrete walkway leading to his front door. Sure, it had seen better days, a few cracks here and there, some weeds pushing through the joints, but it was hardly the disaster zone Margaret made it out to be. "What about it?" Margaret unfolded the papers in her hand with theatrical precision. "I've filed a complaint with the city about the condition of your property. Specifically, the deteriorating sidewalk that's bringing down property values for the entire neighborhood." "Property values?" David laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Margaret, half the sidewalks in this neighborhood look worse than mine, perhaps, but none of them are directly across from a property I'm trying to sell." Her smile was razor-thin. "My realtor says potential buyers are being put off by the aesthetic challenges your home presents." David felt heat creep up his neck. 3 months ago, he'd been laid off from his job at the engineering firm. The severance package was decent, but not enough to cover major home improvements while he searched for new employment. Every dollar counted now. "Look, I know it's not perfect, but perfect." Margaret's laugh was like breaking glass. "David, there are dandelions growing through the cracks. Actual weeds. Do you understand what that does to curb appeal?" "I understand that I'm between jobs right now, and sidewalk repair isn't exactly at the top of my priority list." Margaret's expression softened for exactly half a second before hardening again. "I'm sorry about your employment situation, truly, but that doesn't change the fact that your negligence is costing me money. Real money." She thrust the papers toward him. David scanned the official city letterhead, the formal language demanding immediate action to bring his property into compliance with municipal standards, a fine of $500 if the work wasn't completed within 30 days. $500. David's voice cracked slightly. "Margaret, I can't afford this right now. Perhaps you should have thought of that before letting your property deteriorate." She smoothed her skirt with both hands, a gesture David had learned meant she was preparing to deliver a killing blow. "I've also spoken to the Homeowners Association about the overall condition of your lawn and exterior paint. There may be additional citations coming." The words hit David like physical blows. His lawn wasn't pristine, but he'd been keeping it. The exterior paint was faded, sure, but the house was structurally sound. He'd been planning to tackle these projects once he found steady work again. "You're really going to do this?" David asked quietly. "Kick a man while he's down." "I'm protecting my investment," Margaret replied without a trace of shame. "My house is worth $400,000. I won't let your circumstances ... cost me tens of thousands in lost value." David looked at the woman who'd once borrowed his ladder to hang Christmas lights, who'd accepted packages for her when she was traveling, who'd seemed like a decent neighbor despite her uptight exterior. That person was gone, replaced by someone who saw him as nothing more than an obstacle to her financial goals. "Fine," he said finally. "I'll figure something out. You have 30 days. Margaret headed for the door, then paused. "Oh, and David, I'd appreciate it if you could do something about that oil stain in your driveway as well. It's quite unsightly." After she left, David stood in his living room holding the citation, feeling the walls of his modest home press in around him. He walked to the window and stared across the street at Margaret's house, a pristine 2-story, colonial with professional landscaping, a circular driveway, and a garage that housed her spotless silver BMW. That evening, David sat at his kitchen table with his laptop, scrolling through job listings and calculating his rapidly dwindling savings. The citation lay beside him like an accusation. $500 for sidewalk repair, plus whatever the Homeowners Association might throw at him. He'd been living carefully since the layoff, but this would wipe out most of his emergency fund. His phone buzzed with a text from his sister Sarah. "How's the job search going? Mom's worried about you." David stared at the message for a long moment before typing back. "Fine. Everything's fine." He couldn't bring himself to tell his family about Margaret's crusade. His parents had already offered to help with expenses, but they were on a fixed income. His sister had her own mortgage and 2 kids in college. David had always been the responsible one, the one who had his life together. The idea of admitting he needed help felt like swallowing glass. The next morning, David walked to his mailbox and found Margaret across the street washing her BMW in the driveway. The car gleamed like a silver mirror, not a speck of dust or dirt anywhere on its pristine surface. She caught him looking and waved with exaggerated friendliness. "Beautiful morning, isn't it?" she called out, running a chamois cloth over the car's hood with loving care. David didn't respond. He grabbed his mail and turned to go back inside, but something made him pause. A city truck was parked 2 houses down, and a uniformed worker was taking pictures of another neighbor's property with an official-looking tablet. "Code enforcement," Margaret said, noticing his gaze. "I may have mentioned to them that several properties in the neighborhood could use their attention. We have standards to maintain, after all." David felt something cold and hard settle in his stomach. This wasn't just about his sidewalk. Margaret was systematically targeting anyone whose property didn't meet her exacting standards. He thought about Mrs. Rodriguez, the elderly widow who lived alone and struggled to maintain her yards. About the Johnsons, who'd just had their 3rd baby and were clearly overwhelmed. "You're going after everyone, aren't you?" David said. Margaret's smile never wavered. "I'm being proactive about maintaining property values. It's what any responsible homeowner would do." That afternoon, David walked through the neighborhood with new eyes. Mrs. Rodriguez was in her front yard, staring at a city citation with tears in her eyes. The Johnsons' house had an official notice taped to their front door. Even the Hendersons, who kept their property in decent shape, had received warnings about their fence needing repair. David knocked on Mrs. Rodriguez's door. She answered with red-rimmed eyes and a trembling hand. "Oh, David, hello," she said in her heavily accented English. "I was just... I don't know what to do." She showed him the citation. $700 in fines for various code violations, including a cracked driveway and overgrown shrubs. For a woman living on Social Security, it might as well have been $7,000. "I try to keep up," she said, wiping her eyes. "But since Miguel died, it's so hard. Everything is so expensive." David felt rage building in his chest like a pressure cooker about to explode. Margaret's war on unsightly properties was destroying people who were already struggling, and she was doing it with the cold calculation of someone moving chess pieces around a board. That evening, David sat in his garage, staring at the tools hanging on his He'd always been handy, had learned carpentry and basic contracting from his father. Before the layoff, he'd supplemented his income with weekend renovation projects. The skills were still there, rusty but intact. An idea began to form that started as righteous anger but slowly crystallized into something more deliberate, something that would require patience, planning, and a willingness to bend a few rules of his own. David pulled out his laptop and began researching city codes, property regulations, and something else entirely: the legal requirements for vehicle storage and abandoned property removal. By midnight, he had a plan. It was risky, possibly stupid, and definitely the kind of thing the old David Chen would never have considered. But the old David hadn't been systematically humiliated by a neighbor who treated human suffering as a minor inconvenience in her quest for maximum profit. Margaret Whitmore wanted to play hardball with city regulations. Fine. David had just found the rulebook, and he was pretty sure. David spent the next week moving like a man possessed. Every morning, he watched Margaret's routine from his kitchen window: jog at 6 a.m., return at 6:45, shower, leave for her real estate office at 8:30 sharp. On weekends, she added a second, jog in the evenings, and spent hours detailing that BMW, until it gleamed like liquid mercury. The research phase consumed his nights. City ordinances, property codes, vehicle storage regulations. David absorbed them all with the focus of a lawyer, preparing for trial. But the real breakthrough came when he discovered Section 12.3.7 of the Municipal Code. Any vehicle parked on private property without current registration and insurance was subject to immediate removal as abandoned property. The beauty of it was elegant in its simplicity. Tuesday morning brought another gift. David was checking his mail when he overheard Margaret on her phone, pacing her driveway in her designer suit. "No, Gerald, I need the listing to go live Friday," she was saying, her voice carrying clearly across the street. "The buyer's financing is already approved. We're talking about a same-day closing, if everything goes smoothly." David's pulse quickened. Margaret was selling her house soon, which meant every day counted now. For both of them, he walked over to Mrs. Rodriguez's house, where she was sitting on her front steps, looking defeated. The citation notice was still taped to her door, fluttering in the morning breeze like a flag of surrender. "How are you holding up, Maria?" David asked. She looked up with tired eyes. "The city, they want me to hire someone to fix the driveway. $700, plus the work. I called 3 contractors yesterday. The cheapest estimate was $1,200. David did the math in his head. Mrs. Rodriguez was looking at nearly $2,000 in expenses she couldn't afford. Meanwhile, Margaret's BMW probably cost more than most people made in a year. What if I could help with the repairs? David offered. I've got experience with concrete work. Maria's face brightened slightly. You would do that? Let me talk to the other neighbors first. Maybe we can work something out. By Thursday, David had organized what he privately called the Resistance Council. Mrs. Rodriguez, the Johnsons, the Hendersons, and 3 other families targeted by Margaret's complaint campaign. They met in David's living room, a group of ordinary people pushed to their breaking point by one woman's crusade for property perfection. She's trying to force us all out, said Tom Henderson, a postal worker whose fence repair estimate had come in at $800. Clean up the neighborhood by making it too expensive for working families to live here. It's working, added Jenny Johnson, bouncing her crying baby on her knee. We're already talking about moving. We can't afford the fines and the repairs and still make our mortgage payment. David looked around the room at these decent people neighbors who'd helped each other through storms and power outages, who borrowed cups of sugar and watched each other's kids all being systematically destroyed by Margaret's financial warfare. What if I told you there might be another way? David said quietly. Friday afternoon, David put his plan into motion. He'd spent the morning at the DMV, the city clerk's office, and the police station, gathering information with the methodical precision of an engineer solving a complex problem. Every piece had to fit perfectly, or the whole thing would collapse. At 3 p.m., he called AA Auto Salvage. Yeah, I need a vehicle towed, David said into his phone, standing in his garage where no one could see him. Abandoned car on private property. Owners unresponsive to removal requests. What's the location? Asked the dispatcher. David gave Margaret's address. Silver BMW 7 Series in the driveway. Registration's expired, been sitting there for weeks. Property owner wants it gone. We'll need documentation that it's actually abandoned, the dispatcher said. Police report, or proof you've attempted to contact the owner. I've got all the paperwork. David lied smoothly. How soon can you get someone out there? Monday morning work for you. First thing, around 8 a.m. Perfect. That evening, David sat in his car outside the 24-hour copy center, using their public computer to create what he needed. A fake notice of abandoned vehicle dated 2 weeks earlier. A fabricated final warning from 5 days ago, both printed on generic paper that could have come from anywhere. The documents wouldn't hold up under scrutiny, but they didn't need to. They just needed to look official enough to satisfy a tow truck driver who wanted to collect his fee and move on to the next job. Saturday brought an unexpected complication. David was in his front yard, making a show of measuring his sidewalk for repairs, when Margaret approached with a manila envelope in her hand. David, she called out, her voice honey-sweet with false concern. I have something for you. He straightened up, already knowing this wouldn't be good news. Margaret handed him the envelope with the satisfied smile of someone delivering a checkmate move. Inside were photographs of his house from multiple angles, showing every flaw in high-definition detail. The cracked sidewalk, the oil stain, patches of brown grass, peeling paint on the garage door. Each photo was annotated with arrows and typed comments like safety hazard and aesthetic violation. I thought you should see what potential buyers are seeing, Margaret said. My realtor took these yesterday. We're using them as examples of why the asking price reflects the challenges of the neighborhood. David flipped through the images, feeling his anger rise with each page. She'd turned his home into a case study in urban decay, complete with professional photography that made every minor flaw look like a major catastrophe. There's more, Margaret continued, clearly enjoying herself. I've also compiled a report on property value impacts. Your house alone is costing surrounding properties an estimated $15,000 to $20,000 in reduced market value. You had someone appraise the whole neighborhood, David asked. Due diligence? Margaret said, my buyer wants assurance that property values will remain stable. I had to be honest about the challenges. David closed the envelope carefully. And what did you tell them? That several properties are in violation of city codes, but that active enforcement is underway. I'm confident that by the time they take possession, the neighborhood will be much more suitable. Translation. By the time Margaret closed on her house sale, she expected everyone who couldn't afford her standards to be gone. Mission accomplished, neighborhood gentrified, property values secured. When's your closing? David asked, trying to keep his voice casual. Wednesday, Margaret said, assuming no complications arise. That night, David barely slept. Margaret's timeline changed everything. If she closed Wednesday, she'd be gone by the end of the week. His elaborate plan would accomplish nothing except getting him arrested for filing false reports and theft of a vehicle, unless he moved faster. Sunday evening, David made 3 phone calls. The first was to AA Auto Salvage, moving the pickup. Time to Monday, 6:30 a.m., half an hour before Margaret's usual jog time. The second was to his sister, establishing an alibi by asking her to call him at exactly 6:45 a.m., about a family matter. The third call was the most important. David dialed the number 4, Margaret's real estate office. knowing she wouldn't be there on Sunday evening. When the voicemail picked up, he left a message in a disguised voice. This is City Code Enforcement. We have reports of an abandoned vehicle at 247 Maple Street that needs immediate removal. The property owner has been unresponsive to notices. Please contact us Monday morning to resolve this matter. It was a desperate gambit, but if Margaret got the message early enough Monday, she might think the city was actually removing her car. By the time she figured out what really happened, David would be just another confused neighbor wondering what all the commotion was about. Monday morning arrived, gray and cold, with the kind of persistent drizzle that made everything look miserable. David positioned himself at his kitchen window at 6:15 a.m., coffee mug in hand, watching Margaret's house like a hawk studying prey. At exactly 6:30, the tow truck rumbled down Maple Street, a massive flatbed with AAA Auto Salvage painted on the side in faded yellow letters. The driver was a mountain of a man in coveralls, clearly someone who'd dealt with difficult vehicle recoveries before. David's heart hammered against his ribs as the truck pulled into Margaret's driveway. This was it. The point of no return. The driver climbed out and walked around the BMW, taking pictures with his phone. Then he began hooking up the chains with the efficient movements of someone who'd done this 1,000 times before. At 6:42, Margaret's front door opened. She appeared in her silk robe and slippers, hair still perfect despite having just woken up, and David could see her mouth moving as she rushed toward the tow truck driver. Even from across the street, he could read her body language, confusion shifting rapidly to outrage. The driver showed her some paperwork. Margaret gestured wildly at her house, then at the BMW, clearly trying to explain that this was her car, her property, her mistake, but the driver just shrugged and continued securing the chains. At 6:45, exactly as planned, David's phone rang. Sarah's voice was bright and cheerful. Did I wake you? No, I'm up, David said, loud enough to be heard clearly if anyone was listening. Just having coffee and watching the most amazing thing happen across the street. Through the window, he watched Margaret running toward her house, presumably to get identification, and Margaret's driveway had become ground zero for what David privately dubbed Operation Meltdown. She stood in her power suit, hastily thrown over what looked like pajama pants, screaming into her phone while gesturing at the empty space where her BMW used to be. What do you mean you don't have a record of the pickup? Margaret's voice carried across the street like a fire alarm. Your truck was just here. Your driver took my car. David pretended to water his front plants while eavesdropping, shamelessly. This was better than cable television. No, I did not request a tow. This is theft. Grand Theft Auto. Margaret paced her driveway in tight circles, her heels clicking against the concrete like a metronome counting down to nuclear detonation. Her real estate partner, Gerald, arrived at 8:15 in a gleaming white Lexus, his usually perfect hair disheveled, and his tie askew. David could see them through Margaret's living room window, animated gestures. Margaret pointing repeatedly toward the empty driveway, Gerald checking his watch and shaking his head. Officer Martinez was a patient man in his 50s who'd clearly dealt with his share of neighborhood disputes. He listened to Margaret's breathless account while taking notes, occasionally glancing across the street at David, who was now making a show of measuring his sidewalk cracks with a tape measure. Ma'am, you're saying someone stole your car from your own driveway? Officer Martinez asked. Not someone, a tow truck company, AAA, Auto Salvage. They had paperwork claiming my car was abandoned. And you say you never received any notices about abandonment? Margaret hesitated. Well, there might have been some calls to my office, but that's irrelevant. You can't just take someone's car. David had to bite his lip to keep from grinning. Margaret's own efficiency was working against her. She was so busy she didn't always check her voicemails immediately. We'll need to contact the tow company, Officer Martinez said. Get their side of the story. In the meantime, do you have any idea who might have filed the complaint? Margaret's gaze swept the neighborhood like a searchlight before landing on David. For a moment, their eyes met across the street, and David saw something he'd never seen in Margaret Whitmore's face before. Genuine uncertainty. There have been some neighborhood tensions lately, Margaret said carefully. Officer Martinez followed her gaze. Maybe I should talk to him. David's pulse spiked, but he forced himself to continue measuring sidewalk cracks as the officer crossed the street. Stay calm. Stick to the story. Act like the confused neighbor you're supposed to be. Morning, sir. Officer Martinez, Metro Police. Mind if I ask you a few questions? Not at all, officer, though I have to say, this is pretty exciting for our quiet little street. David gestured toward Margaret's house. Car theft, huh? That's terrible. You didn't see anything unusual this morning? Tow truck? Maybe around 6:30. David made a show of thinking. Actually, yeah. Big flatbed truck woke me up. I figured maybe someone broke down and needed a tow. Why? The truck took your neighbor's BMW. She says it was stolen. Stolen. David's expression of shock was worthy of an Oscar. But wouldn't a thief just drive it away? Why use a tow truck? Officer Martinez studied David's face. Good point. You and Mrs. Whitmore get along, okay? This was the critical moment. David met the officer's eyes directly, projecting the calm confidence of someone with nothing to hide. "We've had our differences lately," David said. "She filed some complaints about my property with the city, but stolen car. Come on, officer. I'm an unemployed engineer, not a criminal mastermind." Something in David's tone, the weary resignation of a man beaten down by bureaucracy, seemed to convince Martinez. The officer's posture relaxed slightly. "Any idea who might have issues with her?" David glanced around the neighborhood meaningfully. "Have you seen all the city citations that have been showing up lately? Mrs. Rodriguez, the Johnsons, the Hengossens. Margaret's been pretty active with code enforcement. I'm not saying anyone would steal her car over it, but people are frustrated." Officer Martinez nodded slowly. David could see the wheels turning. Neighborhood full of people with legitimate grievances against Margaret Whitmore. The investigation just got a lot more complicated. By noon, Margaret's house had become the neighborhood's unofficial entertainment center. Mrs. Rodriguez watched from her front porch with undisguised satisfaction. The Johnson kids pressed their faces against their living room window like they were watching a movie. Even normally reclusive Mr. Patterson had emerged from his house to water plants that clearly didn't need watering. David was in his garage, genuinely working on sidewalk repair materials he'd picked up that morning. When Gerald's Lexus pulled into his driveway, Gerald approached with the cautious air of a man walking through a minefield. "Could we talk for a minute?" David set down his measuring tape. "Sure, what's up?" "Look, I know you and Margaret have had some disagreements lately, but this car situation is serious. We've got a house closing Wednesday that could fall through if this mess isn't resolved." "I'm sorry to hear that," David said, and meant it. Gerald seemed like a decent guy caught in Margaret's wake of destruction, but I don't see how I can help. Gerald glanced around nervously, then lowered his voice. "Between you and me, Margaret can be intense about property standards. Maybe she pushed some people too hard, but she's not a bad person, David. She's just trying to protect her investment by destroying everyone else's lives, by maintaining neighborhood standards that benefit everyone." Gerald's response sounded rehearsed, like something he'd said many times before. "Look, what if we could work something out, get these code enforcement issues resolved for everyone?" David felt a spark of interest. "What kind of something?" "Margaret's got connections at City Hall. She could probably get the fines reduced, maybe even dismissed entirely, for everyone in the neighborhood, in exchange for what?" Gerald hesitated. "Information about who might have taken her car, or encouraged someone else to take it." David almost laughed. Margaret was so convinced someone in the neighborhood was responsible that she was willing to withdraw her complaints to find out who. The irony was beautiful. Her own vindictive campaign had created so many suspects that the police couldn't focus on any one person. "Gerald, I appreciate the offer," David said carefully, "but I honestly don't know who took Margaret's car, and I'm not sure I'd tell you if I did." Gerald's shoulders sagged. "The insurance company won't pay out until the police investigation is complete. The car's worth $60,000. David, Margaret's looking at a huge financial loss if it's not recovered." $60,000. David tried to keep his expression neutral, but inside he was reeling. Margaret's car was worth more than he'd made in his last year of employment, and now it was sitting in some salvage yard, probably already being stripped for parts. That afternoon brought the call David had been dreading. AAA Auto Salvage, returning his original inquiry. "Mr. Chen, this is Bobby from AAA. We got your BMW picked up this morning, but we're having some paperwork issues. The registered owner is claiming the vehicle wasn't actually abandoned." David's mouth went dry. "Paperwork issues?" "Yeah. The police are asking questions about the pickup authorization. We're gonna need you to come down and sort this out. Bring your documentation showing you tried to contact the owner about removal." When do you need me there?" "Soon as possible. If we can't verify the pickup was legitimate, we gotta return the vehicle. And frankly, the owner's making a lot of noise about theft charges." David hung up and stared at his phone. The walls were closing in. Within hours, maybe less, the police would discover that the pickup authorization was fraudulent. Then they'd start asking harder questions about who could have fabricated the paperwork, who had motive, who had opportunity. His engineering mind began calculating odds and scenarios. Best case, he could claim someone else used his name to authorize the pickup. Worst case, jail time for Grand Theft Auto. At 4 p.m., David made a decision that surprised even him. He walked across the street and rang Margaret's doorbell. She answered wearing jeans and a Georgetown University sweatshirt, her perfect hair pulled back in a messy ponytail. Without makeup and designer clothes, she looked younger, more vulnerable, almost human. Her voice was flat, exhausted. "Come to gloat. Actually, I came to help." Margaret's laugh was bitter. "Help? After everything that's happened, may I come in?" She studied his face for a long moment, then stepped aside. Her living room was exactly what David had expected: white furniture, abstract art, everything positioned with mathematical precision. But there were papers scattered across the coffee table, and Margaret's laptop was open to what looked like insurance claim forms. "Nice place," David said. "Cut the small talk. What do you want?" David took a breath. This was either brilliant or insane, and he wouldn't know which until it was over. I know who took your car, he said. Margaret went very still. What? I know who took it, and I know where it is. But I want something in return. You, Margaret's eyes narrowed as the implications. Hit her, you son of a bitch. You took E.T. Didn't take anything, David said calmly. I made some phone calls, filed some paperwork, used the same system you used to destroy half the neighborhood. Margaret's face cycled through shock, rage, and something that might have been admiration. David's phone rang at 6:47 a.m. Tuesday morning, jolting him from the first decent sleep he'd had in days. The caller ID showed a number he didn't recognize, but the voice was unmistakably Bobby from AA Auto Salvage. Mr. Chen, we got a problem, big problem. The owner of that BMW, she's here with police and a lawyer, demanding her car back, says the whole thing's fraudulent. David's stomach dropped to somewhere around his ankles. She's there now. Yeah, and she's pissed. Real pissed. You need to get down here immediately with your documentation, or we're calling this in as theft. I ain't losing my license over some neighborhood dispute. I'll be right there, David said, already reaching for his clothes. The drive to AA Auto Salvage felt like a funeral procession. David rehearsed his confession speech, trying to find words that might convince a judge he wasn't a career criminal, just a desperate man who'd made one spectacular mistake. By the time he pulled into the salvage yard, he'd mentally prepared for handcuffs. Instead, he found Margaret standing next to her pristine BMW, apparently unharmed. While Bobby, the tow yard operator, looked like he wanted to disappear into the nearest hole, a uniformed police officer stood nearby taking notes, and a woman in an expensive suit was photographing everything with professional thoroughness. There he is, Margaret announced as David approached. The mastermind himself. David braced himself for arrest, but Margaret's tone wasn't victorious. If anything, she sounded amused. Officer Martinez looked up from his notepad. Mr. Chen, we need to talk. I know, David said quietly. I'm ready to make a statement. Good, because Mrs. Whitmore here has been telling us quite a story. David glanced at Margaret, trying to read her expression. She gave him the slightest nod, so subtle he might have imagined it. According to Mrs. Whitmore, Officer Martinez continued, this was all a big misunderstanding. Apparently, she asked you to help arrange storage for her vehicle while she was preparing for her house sale, and there was some confusion about the paperwork. David's brain took a moment to process what he was hearing. Margaret was lying to the police to protect him. But why? That's right, David said carefully. Margaret asked me to handle the logistics, and I guess I got the forms mixed up. Bobby looked skeptical. Forms don't get mixed up that bad, Mr. Chen. Somebody called my office claiming this was abandoned property. I may have used the wrong terminology, David said, improvising desperately. I'm not familiar with tow truck procedures. The lawyer David realized stepped forward with a manila folder. Officer Martinez, my client has decided not to press charges. She's satisfied this was a miscommunication between neighbors, and she just wants her vehicle returned. Officer Martinez looked between David and Margaret like a man trying to solve a puzzle with half the pieces missing. Mrs. Whitmore, yesterday, you were convinced this was theft. Yesterday I was upset and not thinking clearly. Margaret replied smoothly. After sleeping on it, I remembered asking David for help with vehicle storage. The paperwork confusion makes perfect sense now. David watched this performance with growing amazement. Margaret Whitmore was lying with the skill of a professional politician, creating a plausible alternative narrative that kept both of them out of jail. But she was also doing something more. She was saving his life, and he had no idea why. 30 minutes later, after signatures and paperwork and a towing fee that made David's eyes water, Margaret's BMW was loaded onto a legitimate tow truck for return to her driveway. David found himself standing next to Margaret in the salvage yard parking lot, both of them watching her $60,000 car disappear around the corner. Why? David asked finally. Margaret was quiet for a long moment. Because last night, after you left, I made those phone calls. Withdrew all the complaints, just like I promised. And then I sat in my perfect house with my perfect furniture, thinking about what kind of person I'd become. She pulled out her phone and showed David her recent call log. City Planning Department, Code Enforcement, Homeowners Association, call after call, each one lasting several minutes. Mrs. Rodriguez cried when I called to apologize. Margaret continued. Actually cried. She said she'd been praying someone would help her, and she thought God had forgotten about her. Margaret's voice caught slightly. I made an 80-year-old woman think God had forgotten about her because her driveway had some cracks. David didn't know what to say to that. And the Johnsons? Margaret went on. Do you know they've been saving for 2 years to repaint their house? 2 years? Setting aside $20 a month because that's all they could afford? My complaints were going to force them to spend that money on fines instead. They walked to their cars in silence. David was almost to his Honda when Margaret called out, David, how did you know my car registration was expired? David froze. He'd been so focused on the towing scam that he'd never actually checked Margaret's registration. It had been a complete guess, based on nothing more than the hope that someone as busy as Margaret might have overlooked something routine. Lucky guess, he said. Margaret laughed a real laugh. not the calculated sounds she usually made. It expired 3 months ago. I've been so busy with house showings and complaints and trying to manage everything that I completely forgot to renew it. Your abandoned vehicle story was actually technically accurate. David stared at her. You're kidding? I'm not. Which means legally, you might have had grounds to have it towed anyway. The irony is killing me. Wednesday morning brought unexpected visitors. David was eating breakfast when he saw Mrs. Rodriguez walking up his front steps, followed by Tom Henderson, Jenny Johnson carrying her baby, and several other neighbors. For a moment, he panicked. Had they figured out what he'd done? Mrs. Rodriguez rang the doorbell with the determination of a woman on a mission. David, she said when he opened the door, we need to talk. They filed into his living room, and David noticed immediately that everyone looked ... different, lighter somehow, like people who'd been carrying heavy burdens that had suddenly been lifted. The city called yesterday, Mrs. Rodriguez announced. All charges dropped, all fines canceled. They said there had been an error in the complaint process. That's great news, David said carefully. And then, Tom Henderson added, Margaret Whitmore called each of us personally, apologized for everything, said she'd been wrong to cause so much trouble. Jenny Johnson shifted her baby to her other arm. She's even offering to help coordinate neighborhood repairs. Said she knows contractors who might give us group discounts. David tried to process this information. Margaret wasn't just keeping her word, she was going above and beyond, actively trying to fix the damage she'd caused. But here's the thing, Mrs. Rodriguez continued, her voice taking on a conspiratorial tone. Margaret also mentioned that a neighbor had helped her understand how her actions were affecting people. She wouldn't say who, but 8 pairs of eyes focused on David with laser precision. We know it was you, Tom said simply. Question is, how did you do it? David looked around at these good people, his neighbors, his friends, and made a decision. They deserved the truth. Most of it anyway. I may have demonstrated to Margaret what it feels like when someone uses bureaucracy as a weapon against you, he said carefully. Details, Jenny demanded. We want details. So David told them. Not about the forged paperwork or the theft charges, but about research and phone calls and using the system against itself. About finding Margaret's weak spots and applying pressure with surgical precision. About turning her own tactics against her until she understood what she was doing to other people. When he finished, the room was quiet for a long moment. Then Mrs. Rodriguez started laughing. You had her car towed, she said, wiping tears from her eyes. You actually had Margaret Whitmore's precious BMW towed. Technically, I arranged for its relocation, David corrected. The laughter was contagious. Soon, everyone was giggling like conspirators, sharing the sweet satisfaction of seeing a bully get exactly what they deserved. So what happens now? Tom asked. Margaret's closing on her house today, right? Right, David confirmed. He'd seen the moving truck that morning, watched Margaret directing workers with military precision. She'll be gone by the weekend. Good riddance, someone muttered. But David found himself thinking about Margaret's phone calls the night before, about her genuine remorse and her offers to help with repairs. Maybe people could change, maybe crisis could create growth instead of just destruction. That evening, David was in his garage, organizing tools when Margaret appeared in his driveway. She was wearing jeans and a simple sweater, her hair in a ponytail, looking more relaxed than he'd ever seen her. Moving day went well, David asked. Closing went through without any problems. New owners seem nice young couple with 2 kids. They're excited about the neighborhood. Margaret paused. I told them about the community spirit here. How neighbors look out for each other. They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. I owe you an apology, Margaret said finally. And a thank you. For what? For showing me who I'd become. And for giving me a chance to become someone better. She pulled an envelope from her purse. This is for you. David opened it to find a check for $500, exactly the amount of his side.